It is amazing what a little bit of power and how that little bit of power can change people in really big ways. When I was an early teen in high school, I was given just a little bit of authority. I was tasked with the ginormous responsibility of getting to decide what next songbook we would buy as a church. And all I was doing was going through the songbook and saying, okay, this songbook has like all the old songs we like to sing, but it also has some of the new songs. I'd been to youth rallies, church camps, so I knew some of the newer songs. So my dad had me go through and kind of look through and see which songbook would best fit us. And this was extremely small task. But for me, as a high schooler, I thought, man, this is a lot of power. This is a lot of authority I have been given. And so as we ordered the songbooks, nobody told me this, nobody gave me this impression, but for whatever reason, I thought I was in charge of the songbooks at that point. And so I had these songbooks and we got them and we were going to distribute them. We had ordered these extra songbooks for the song leaders, so we had like a set amount of books, like 20 extra books for song leaders to take home so they could pick songs at home. And again, nobody told me this, but for some reason I thought I was in charge of who got those extra songbooks. And so as we were unpacking that day, another teen around my same age came and he was going to take a book and he wanted to just take that book home. There's nothing wrong with that, but wanted to take that book home and just look through it. And again, nobody gave me this authority, but I decided, and as I saw him pick up that songbook, I thought, who in the world does this guy think he is? He's messing with my songbooks. And so I told him. And I set him straight. And when I got home, my parents set me straight. Because I did not have that authority that I thought that I had. And it's amazing what even the most menial amount of authority can be given to us, can impact us, and create a hunger in us for more authority and more power. Just a little bit of power can change us and affect us in some really big ways. Today, we look at James and John. We're going to look at James and John. And there's a specific story that we find in Mark chapter 10 where they have this hunger for this type of authority. They have hunger for some glory. They have hunger for power. And we've seen people like this in our life before. We've seen people who take a little bit of authority, a little bit of power, and they really just give them that inch of authority, they run and take a mile with it. And it's amazing what we'll do with the smallest amount of authority. We see this in our workplace, where people are given a little bit of authority. Probably the party planning committees of the world, right? Take that authority and run with it. We see this in student organizations, in parents. You see this in the PTA meetings at school. Right? Someone's given some power, someone's given a little bit of authority. And we see this. We see this in politics. We see this even in the church, where people are desiring places of glory and places of authority. And maybe we've even seen this in ourselves. And so today with John and James, they found themselves in a similar situation. And it's a very odd story, by the way, and it's told by both Mark and Matthew. We're just going to focus on what Mark says today. So here in Mark chapter 10, James and John come to Jesus with a request. Look with me at verses 35 through 37. It says, "And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him and said to him, 'Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you.'" That's a pretty bold request. Can you imagine going up to Jesus and saying, "Listen, I want you to do whatever I ask you to do." Right? Surely there's something perhaps there culturally that it's a request, a formal request, because I can't imagine that they're going and demanding as if they're commanding Jesus. And so it seems to still, even though it kind of sounds that way, I think it was still some type of formal request that they were making. Now Matthew tells us something a little bit differently. Matthew includes the fact that their mom was there. And in fact, the subtitle in my Bible said, "A mother's request." And so I can only imagine, okay, a mom comes with James and John and comes and makes this request. And it's a pretty bold request, as we're going to see here. And what happens then is they ask him, Jesus says, "Okay, well, what would you like me to do for you?" In verse 36. And it says this in verse 37, "And they said to him, 'Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory.'" Now that's a pretty bold request. Not only did they, according to Matthew's account, they and their mother come to Jesus and say, we want you to do whatever we ask of you. It's likely, we know that they were actually family, and so it's likely them being cousins that they thought they would get this kind of special relationship with Jesus and had a bit of special status within their family. And so they come to Jesus and ask this, but not only was it bold enough for them to do that, but then they ask, okay, we want the highest status that we could possibly have in your kingdom. We want to be on your right hand and on your left hand. And during that time, that was a very powerful image for authority and for power. And so they ask this. And it's easy for us to look at them and think, wow, these are some really conceited people. They're following Jesus just for gain. And it's easy to point the finger at them. But then when we look at what was going on, and we look at what the disciples thought was going on with the mission and the life of Jesus, and maybe we can understand it a bit more. If you remember, they had a complete misunderstanding of what Jesus had come to do. We now see that Jesus was establishing the spiritual kingdom, that he was establishing the church, and that he was establishing his rule and reign through the church. But they did not have that understanding. In fact, even once Jesus was resurrected, it seems, and before they had received the Holy Spirit, it seems that they were still confused about it. If you look over in Acts chapter 1, verse 6, it says, that Peter and the apostles say to Jesus, "Will you now at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" They thought that the Messiah would come and would eliminate the Romans, and then that Israel would be restored as this nation on earth, and that the Messiah would come and reign. They had a complete misunderstanding. And on top of that, Jesus had brought up on other occasions, such as Matthew chapter 19, verse 28, and Luke 20, verse 30, where Jesus told them that in the kingdom of heaven that they will one day be reigning on 12 thrones with him. Okay, so John and James aren't just pulling this out of thin air. This is based on misunderstandings of what Jesus was there to do. So them thinking Jesus is, and they're getting closer and closer to Jerusalem, and so they think Jesus is here to set up this earthly nation in this organization. It was only natural to wonder, okay, where am I going to fit at in this kingdom? They were the 12 disciples. And so I'm not justifying their greed for power and authority. But what I am doing is acknowledging that it made sense when you consider their context of what they thought was happening. They thought they were going to be the generals of the army that the Messiah was going to create. Right? They had this misunderstanding that Jesus wasn't setting up this earthly kingdom, but he was setting up a heavenly kingdom. They did not understand that. And not only that, this was not the first time this conversation had come up. If you look at the preceding chapter, it comes up in John chapter 9 and verse 34, where the disciples, right, it's not just John and James who are having this disagreement or are seeking more power, because the text, if you just read Mark 10, it kind of seems that way. It says in verse 41 that the disciples were angry when they saw John and James make this request. And so it's easy to point fingers at John and James, but when you realize the only reason the other disciples were angry was because John and James would be taking the spots that they themselves were longing after. They weren't mad because they thought they were unhumble or they thought they were hungry for power. They thought John and James were these hungry power people. They were mad because they were hungry for power too, and John and James were taking that spot. All right, because we see that in the preceding chapter, in Mark chapter 9, verse 34, where the disciples are in an argument about who is the greatest in the kingdom. And so what we see in this request is, of course, hunger for power, hunger for authority, hunger for glory. But John and James are not alone in that desire. The other 10 disciples have that very same desire. And if we're honest with ourselves, we have felt a very similar desire at times in our life, in the various scenarios that I brought up earlier. And so here's how Jesus then answers. Look with me at verse 38 through 41. 38 through 41, it says, Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? And so what here Jesus is talking about, he's not talking about baptism as you and I talk about baptism, but here he's talking about this baptism of suffering, this baptism of hardship. The word baptism is not just a religious term. We don't really use baptize, or the word baptism. We don't use that in our daily conversation. It's a religious term today, but at their time it just meant to be submersed. It meant to immerse. It meant to be fully submerged. And so Jesus said, are you able to be fully submerged in the same thing that I'm going to be fully submerged in? In other words, are you able to bear this cup? And that word cup also has the symbolism of hardship. And actually, I did not realize this. I thought the word cup simply would be referring to the cross. But the word cup is also used in Old Testament imagery, talking about bearing the cup, talking about the cup of salvation. And it often reflects the idea of either suffering or it reflects the idea of destiny. And I'm not talking about like mystical destiny. I'm just talking about the purpose of your life, or what would be the end of your life. And so it often talks about the cup in that way as well, as what would end up happening to you. And so when Jesus uses that imagery in the garden, he talks about the cup that he would bear, and he asked to the Father, we sang that song this morning, let this cup pass from me, I pray. He's pulling back Old Testament imagery in which that term is used. Now, of course, in light of Jesus' life, that points to the cup he too would bear. And he asks John and James and says, are you able to bear this cup? Are you able to experience the baptism in which I am baptized? In other words, are you able to go down the road of hardship with me? Are you truly committed? Because contrary to what they thought this was a glorious position. And it is a glorious position, but it's a glorious position for God. It brings God glory. But for the disciples, it would be a road to glory. Glory for God is a road of hardship. Right? When they thought of Jesus as king, they had these beautiful pictures of what the kingdom would look like, and they thought they would take part in that. And Jesus says, you will, but it's not what you think it is. He said, instead, there's a road of hardship ahead for us. And in that road of hardship, what the world would consider glory, when you think of glory as far as the world would think of it, that's not what you will receive. In fact, as far as worldly standards go, you're going to receive worldly shame, as they're going to think you're foolish for going down this road with me. And he says, are you able to bear this cup? Are you able to experience this baptism? And here's what they say. They say, yes, we are able. And Jesus says, the cup that I drink, I will drink. And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand and at my left hand is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it is prepared. And so ultimately Jesus says, that's not mine to give, first of all. He says, you've misunderstood what you've asked. You're asking for something that's not the reality of what it is. You're asking for this glory, this power, this earthly glory, this earthly vanity. He says, but that's not what my kingdom's about. You've misunderstood it. He said, the road to glory is one of hardship. In verse 41, it says, and when the 10 heard it, they became indignant at James and John. But then here's Jesus' second part of the answer. He says, and here's how you misunderstood this, is you thought the road to glory was exaltation, is that you're going to be exalted to the throne as far as worldly standards go. He says, but that's not how you receive the throne. That's not how you receive the crown of righteousness, which we're all promised in Revelation chapter 2:10. That's not how you receive the crown. He says, instead, the greatest among you, right? That's what their debate was really about. Who's the greatest among us? If the disciples. And Jesus says, the greatest among you is the least among you. Verse 42, look with me. And Jesus called them to him and said to him, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and the great ones exercise authority over them. He says, look at the world, look at the Gentiles. They take this power and authority, and they use it, and they misuse it. And he says, this power that you're longing after, this is the same type of power that the Gentiles have, and they misuse it. But then he goes on and he says, so these earthly rulers, it's all about exalting self. It's all about having power. It's all about having authority. He says, but let it not be done for you. It says, but it shall not be so among you, verse 43. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be a servant of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. So what Jesus does here is that he offers an alternative path, an alternative road to greatness. One that they likely had not considered. And for us, it's really easy for us to think, yes, the path to greatness is servanthood. Because we're in a country that was founded on these type of ideas, where it's ingrained in our culture. We're 2,000 years after these things have happened. And so Christianity and Christian principles are one, grounded in our society, but it's grounded in our mind too. So this is not a foreign concept for us to hear. But for them, this was a foreign concept. They looked at the Gentiles, they looked at the rulers, they looked at the emperors, and they thought that Jesus would be a king like them, and that they would receive power and authority over those rulers in a similar way to how those rulers came to power. But Jesus says, no, that's not how it's going to be for you. The greatest among you is the servant. If you want to be great in the kingdom of God, one, it shouldn't be for your own greatness' sake. It should be for the glory of God, right? Matthew 5, verse 16. You let your lights shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. But in order to achieve that, in order to bring glory to God, is to be a servant. And that was a radical idea for its time. And that's still a radical idea for our time. And so Jesus redefines the term greatness. He says greatness is not being exalted above others like the Gentiles. Greatness is not about being exalted above others. It is about being humbled in service to others. Greatness is not about being exalted above others. It is being humbled in service to others. And I think that's ultimately what Jesus is saying. And we see this most perfectly in the life of Jesus. Right? He didn't come as this great emperor who conquered all the land. But instead, the King of all kings, the Lord of all lords, came to this earth. And what did he do? He washed feet. John chapter 13, verses 30 through about 40. Right? And that was a radical thing for Jesus to do. Is because they expected him to be reigning, and instead he was washing feet. You would expect the red carpet being put out for him, and people would be serving him. Yet he says, I didn't come to be served, but I have come to serve. And ultimately what Jesus says is, ultimately I am doing that by offering my life as a ransom for many. Mark 10, verse 45. And we see this even kind of painted out in Philippians chapter 2, 3 through 4. And this same idea is presented here by Paul, and I can't help as if he's drawing back to some of these same types of passages that we've looked at today. He says, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit. It says, don't be going out and looking this ambitious way of looking at life and looking at how you can gain more and more of this worldly greatness. He says, but in humility, count others more significant than yourselves. And let each of you not look to their own interests, but also look to the interest of others. Why, Paul? He says, and have this mind among yourselves, because this was the same mind that was in Jesus Christ, who though was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being humbled in human form, and he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. In other words, for the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and he gave his life a ransom for many. And ultimately, Jesus' message here, the path to greatness, the path to righteousness in God's eyes, in order to receive the crown of glory, is that in order to wear the crown, you must bear the cross. In order to wear the crown, to receive the glory of God, to be received in Him, you must bear the cross. Now, that's not a message that as far as worldly standards goes that we might want to hear. But that's the message that Jesus gave to his disciples. And it's not a message of worldly glory, of worldly fame, of worldly exaltation, but it's a message where true satisfaction in this life was found. And it's a message of where true glory in the name of God is found. And that's a message that Jesus ultimately came to deliver to us. Through his life, he showed us how to become a servant. And through his death, he made it possible for us to become servants of God. If you're here this morning, and maybe you've been down that path, you've been trying to seek glory, fame, or to seek power and authority in your workplace, or whatever situation you might find yourself in, I would encourage you to look to Jesus. He was a man who had all right to all power and all authority on this earth, yet instead he humbled himself in order to become a servant.